Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the role of the court jester. If that makes you think of a joker in a deck of cards, a clown, or a comedian, then you're on the right track. But what, you might rightly ask, does that have to do with human risk? Good question. The answer is that the comedy deployed by jesters provides a vehicle for highlighting flaws in human decision-making. As I explored in the last two episodes of this show with comedian and impressionist Josh Berry, do check those out if you haven't heard them. He's fascinating as a guest. Comedy is a very powerful way of flagging up instances of human risk because it allows messages to be communicated that might otherwise be unpalatable to those on the receiving end. Jesters are also often called fools, which reminds me that I need to say a big thank you to my former colleague and regular listener to the show, Simon Rogerson, because it was Simon who, when we worked together, pointed out that the role we were doing in compliance and risk management was in essence what the court jester used to do. By permitting the jester to make jokes about what they've observed, the monarch would receive feedback they wouldn't get from elsewhere. Simon's point that jesters were a form of risk management tool is something that's stuck with me ever since. So once I discovered a book called Fools Are Everywhere, The Court Jester Around the World, which explored the subject in a really engaging way and drew the kinds of parallels that Simon had suggested to me, I knew I had to get the author Béatrice Otto onto the show. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Béatrice Otto on fools. Béatrice, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you. And look, I know all about you, but my listeners might not. Can you give us a little pen portrait of who you are and your areas of interest?
Sure. I'm a writer, and my main area of interest is fools and jesters, which I got into because I studied Chinese. That it sounds a sort of strange route to enter the subject. But when I was studying classical Chinese, I discovered they had jesters that were basically like King Lear's fool. And that sowed a little seed and led to a lifetime passion for this subject.
Amazing. And what is it that interests you about fools and jesters?
I admire them. And they have many qualities that I wish I had. So I guess it's envy is one thing. Firstly, they're incredibly resilient. They cope with very tense situations and reactions and so on. Very quick-witted. They're kind of psychologists on the fly. You know, they figure out the situation, the context, and how to respond to it lightning fast and with no apparent formal training. So they're very good at winging it. And they're fearless. They will speak truth to power no matter what the consequences. And sometimes there were negative consequences. And sometimes they even managed to talk their way out of that. So it's admiration and a degree of envy that got me interested.
And so we have this ancient structure, which I'll try and define and tell me where I've got this wrong, which is basically this idea that we have a monarch or someone in a position of power, and there is one individual who is, or possibly a collection of individuals, but there's a specific role here where they are allowed to say things that other people wouldn't be allowed to say, and there's this element of comedy that sort of. And so, in essence, you know, what fascinates me about this is we've created a sort of risk management tool in that things are called out that otherwise wouldn't be able to be called out.
I think that's really it. And one of the things I find fascinating is these power structures in the past. They were very structured, hierarchical. It was very clear who was the boss, and the boss had often almost unlimited power, including life and death decisions concerning the people around them. And yet somehow it seems very common in different, very diverse cultures that you would allow this person, or as you said, sometimes more than one, to have a freedom to just speak out. And so you have a very formal structure, and you have a kind of an element written into that structure that is, if you like, chaotic. You allow somebody that is liminal and chaotic to exist within a power structure. And that I'm not sure the extent to which we still have that. And it seems a certain degree of intuitive wisdom that led to that being created and tolerated.
Presumably the sort of the comedic element provides a bit of a shield, because that differentiates it from anyone else. And it's almost, I always seen it as, one, it's an effective vehicle for communication, but two, it's a cloak that says this is very different to any of you underlings criticizing me. Is that the right way to look at it?
That's it. The comedic element, firstly, as you say, you basically can sugarcoat a pill that might be a bit bitter. Instead of saying you're an idiot, Your Majesty, you make him laugh, or usually a him, sometimes a her, mostly male. So the humor side was definitely part of the cloak. The other side, and you have this more, I think, in Europe, was this idea of folly. So a strong element in Europe was a sort of appreciation of the fool as somebody who might have a mental or physical difference to the rest of us. And that would give them a certain degree of license. And that license could be so valuable that you might not have some sort of difference mentally, but you might fake it because it's useful. It gives you, and Shakespeare talks about using folly as a stalking horse. So you had people who were what we would now call insane, who would have a role in the European court. But you had people who would just borrow a bit of that because then they could get away with saying all kinds of things. And to the extent, it's interesting, in Scottish law over about 150 years, they kept bringing in new laws to restrict what they call the feigning of fools. In other words, there were too many people who were taking advantage of this. And they were terrible punishments if you were found to be feigning folly. And it didn't seem to deter them because they had to keep bringing in new, we're going to nail your ear to a tree because you're feigning folly. You'd think that would put people off. But they would keep reissuing the law, so that's a kind of interesting, isolated example of a legal attempt to contain this feigning of folly.
And one of the things that's wonderful about your book is you pick lots and lots of examples, and you started. I mean, you talked about China, which, as you say, is not the obvious place to go when one thinks about, particularly for sort of listeners that are based in the West. If you ask somebody, it would seem like a Western invention, and yet what you highlight in your book is that this is quite a common practice across the world. Is the basic construct the same? Or are there differences in the way this manifests? In other words, are there cultural differences in the way it manifests itself?
The basic construct is the same. I think the distinction is this idea of having people that they called in the past naturals. A natural fool could be somebody with some sort of mental difference or aberration, and that being somebody who would be protected, who could be employed at court as a jester. You also had dwarfs, but this mental difference is very much a European distinction. Elsewhere, including China, including the Aztecs, it could be a physical difference. So dwarfs were quite commonly jesters, and jesters could be dwarfs. Doesn't mean all dwarfs in court were jesters or vice versa. But I think it's interesting because literally, physically, somebody who's a dwarf or has some other physical difference has a different point of view. Their angle on the world
quite literally,
right, yeah, they have a different perspective, and I think that's another element that was very valuable to the monarch or equivalent. Another element, I think, is they tended to come from a humble background. So you, as the king, your advisors would be from a more patrician or educated background, but then you've got somebody who could be pretty directly from, if you like to put it that way, the people. Who could speak up for different people and bring, again, a different social perspective.
I mean, this is absolutely amazing. So this is neurodiversity.
That's it.
And being recognized clearly that phrase wouldn't have existed, but the basic dynamic of, I need someone that is thinking completely different to me to help me to do or to manage risk better, in simple terms.
And for example, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma in the 16th century, he would have people, some pop up on my screen, just what you need. He would have people with hunchbacks or dwarfs or other physical deformities, and he they would entertain him and so on. And he said, but among their jokes, there are often some important truths. So direct recognition of that. And another example is the first named jester we have on record, or on record so far as I've got digging, was in the 7th century BC, a Chinese jester. And he recommended himself for a kind of diplomatic mission by saying, "I'm a jester, my words cannot give offense." And that kind of set that's it for jesters for the rest of history until they started fading out. And I'm sure we'll come back to that.
yeah, absolutely. So this isn't something that's sort of documented clearly in terms of sort of in laws. It's just something that monarchs and powerful people recognized intrinsically.
Yes, and so there's a lot of testimony to that license, but as you say, it's not formalized. And the whole process for recruiting a jester, I mean, in European courts in China, they could come from a kind of natural pool of entertainers. So there's often a musical element or a performing element. In China, they might come from what was called something like the Court Entertainments Bureau. You can imagine there's a department within a court handling masks and skits and plays and music and so on. So they often came from that background, but they could also be recruited in a very ad hoc, meritocratic way, whereby, for example, a nobleman could be trotting through a village and he encounters what would have impolitely been called the village idiot. And he says to the king, I think I've found your next fool. Let's bring him in. And that was literally how they could be recruited. Or they could come from, we have, for example, the English accounts talk about, on court accounts, on one musician says, "What, the looter." In other words, the guy who plays the lute, not somebody who steals things. Right, yeah, looter, ding-ling-ling. So what, the looter, soon after becomes what, the fool. So maybe he was playing the lute and then he cracked a few jokes and then they said, this is kind of our next fool. So it was a sort of informal meritocratic process.
And there's something interesting in the, I mean, you referenced the village idiot. Mm. And the word fool has sort of negative connotations. One of the things that's interesting is that that's necessary for the comedy aspect of it and the sort of cloaking. Mm. But obviously that implies sort of ignorance and a lack of perspective. So how do we square the fact that for the insight, or do we just say that actually a broken clock is right twice a day? In other words, they may inadvertently stumble across some wisdom without realizing it. Are they deliberately choosing people that are idiots, for want of a better phrase, or is that just a sort of byproduct of the comedy?
That's a European feature. In the Chinese court, none of them were what we call natural fools. They were entertainers who would take on this role of speaking out. I guess the fool element. One element is, you might be in a meeting with the board, and you speak out and say what everybody else is thinking. And the CEO looks at you like, okay, you get the chop. Other people say, what an idiot. Why didn't you keep your mouth shut? Right? They're glad you've asked that question or raised that issue, but they wouldn't do it. They say, I wouldn't risk my...
So it's a foolish strategy.
It's a foolish strategy because it was a risky strategy. So, to your point about risk management, they helped the court or the power structures with their risk management, but they took big risks to do that, even with having this license. So still, you could.
And can you talk a little bit about what? And I recognize it's going to be different in different countries, but talk a little bit about the limits that are in place, because it's not a sort of freedom to say whatever you think. And clearly, there comes a time, and there are plenty of examples, as you highlight, of people that. I'll put it politely, removed from post for pushing the envelope too far. How did that work?
I think that firstly, there were no rules. As we know, it was a very informal structure. So there was nothing to say, you can say this and you can't say that. Theoretically, you can say anything. You're a jester. You have that. Your words cannot give offense. On the other hand, you're dealing with a human being. That's why your whole business is human risk. And today, maybe his gout is playing up. And you feel you need to say something and you go ahead and say it and you just pick the wrong moment. Many times you pick the right moment and you get your point across and you change behavior. And we particularly see that's very well attested to in the Chinese histories and anecdotes and so on. But there are times you just get it wrong. In Europe, it tended to be, there are lots of stories, and many of them are sort of mythical, fun stories about the jester being kicked out of court. So they just get banished from court. There are historical examples of that. So Archie Armstrong, the jester to James I and James VI, same person, was banished from court. But there are lots of joking stories about they get kicked out of court. The king may say, never show your face in court again. And then they turn up with a bucket over their head, right? Or don't set foot in my court again. And then they put some earth from outside the court inside their boots so they're not treading on the court itself. So all these tricks. In China, we actually have two historical examples of the jester speaking out. In one case, he was really warning the king that he was boozing and partying too much and he should pay attention to affairs of state. And in anger, the king had him executed and then really sort of regretted. He said, all he was trying to do is to advise me and help me do things properly. In another case, the jester, and some of the Chinese jesters have interesting names in terms of this truth-telling role. His name was Truly Assisting Uprightness. So he tried to truly assist uprightness. There was a minister who was very good at collecting taxes, in other words, rather aggressive in collecting tax. There was a drought, and the emperor said, are people suffering because of this drought? And the minister said, no, everything's fine, don't worry. And the tax keeps coming in. So he was praised for doing a good job. But the jester let it be known that, in fact, people were really struggling during a drought to meet the tax obligations, which were severe. And as a result of that, he was actually tried for sort of attacking the government for sedition, and he was executed. And again, okay, it's a bit late, but again, the emperor said that was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. He was trying to help us. So those are the only two examples I have of actually the jester getting the chop.
And a very 21st century spin on it, but I'm intrigued. How were they remunerated? In the sense that if they were more, was it around the comedy, was it around the insight, or was there linkage between the two?
Well, I think they were given food and board, so that sort of came with the territory. They were looked after pretty well. We have some fantastic examples, very rich examples from European court account books. It tells you all kinds of things, but they were given lots of perks as well. So the Spanish court accounts, some kind archivist went through hundreds of years of court accounts looking for jesters. We really need more people like that. And they found, for example, jesters who were given, okay, we grant him 2 years leave to go back to Italy to see his family, or we grant a pension to his widow, or we grant him an allowance of ice in summer and coal in winter, or we grant beautiful damask clothing, or he can have my cast-off damask clothing. In China, you don't have that kind of detail, but you have in the anecdotes, which is fun. It'll say, the emperor burst out laughing and gave him 100 bolts of silk. So these sort of spontaneous rewards. And then you have examples of jesters sort of manipulating in a fun way the king or the emperor to get a reward. So one of the Chinese jesters needed some cash for his mother's funeral. So he came in and said, Your Majesty, I'm trying to imitate your beautiful calligraphy. And look, here's what I've done. I've sort of, I can't quite get your beautiful signature right. So the emperor then does his signature. And then the jester writes above, I hereby ask the treasury to pay the jester. So they do that kind of thing. They, in a nice way manipulate. And then the emperor laughs and goes along with it.
I love that.
Try it on your boss.
Yeah, right. That's right. And so there's this effective. Is any obvious places where this has been was sort of tried and rejected early? I mean, we'll come on to sort of look at why it fell out of use more broadly. But are there any areas where culturally it didn't? They looked at it and didn't touch it?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we have India had a rich tradition, and also in their theatre, just as we do in say English theatre, you have a rich tradition of fools, particularly Shakespearean and so on. So India had a strong tradition. China did. Europe, obviously. There are ritual clowns in different tribes in North America that had something of that role. So it might not be that they're invested with that role all the time, but they might on certain occasions be given that privilege. And there's one ritual clown, for example, it says he would walk around saying that the chief was no good, and then the elders would get together and replace the chief. So he had clearly quite a powerful role when he was invested with that freedom. We know the Aztecs had them. So quite a diverse range of cultures. And that was what got me interested in the first place, was when I came across the Chinese jesters. And I thought, gosh, that's such a different culture to ours. And yet this is Lear's fool. It's the same person.
Yeah, and that was really where I was going with the question, was really to sort of say, is this seems to be a universal human response to it, that regardless of your culture or the environment that you're in, it seems to make sense.
Yeah, and you had it also, for example, in the Arab world, in Central Asia as well. You had this role, this fool speaking out and so on. So it does there seems to be something innate. And it's interesting how it emerges in this kind of organic fashion.
And so that brings us nicely. So that we talked about the emergence. You mentioned the fact that it sort of started to disappear. Why did that happen? Because it seems, based on all the things you said, this seems like a really, really powerful tool.
Yeah.
I mean, we all like a bit of comedy, so you're almost getting two things for one, which is a bit of risk management and a bit of comedy at the same time.
Yeah. I'm still struggling with why it disappeared, but I think it's a number of factors. I don't think there's any simple answer. One is probably the rise of theatre, certainly in Europe. I think that had an influence. And in China, in a way, the jesters were the prototype theatre. So sometimes a group of jesters in the Chinese court is quite common. They would get together and come up with a kind of skit, an informal little playlet of a few minutes, act something out in order to communicate with the emperor, maybe about nepotism, corruption, excessive tax, something like that. And they would act that out, and the emperor in many cases got the point and even changed the policy or behavior, or chose to ignore it. And you had something similar for example, in Elizabeth I's court, where the court masks, these plays put on in court, were a mechanism for communicating with the queen. And she could acknowledge or ignore the message being conveyed. And I think certainly in China, those skits were part of the sort of prototype of drama. And then drama itself, theatre, took off. And that may be part of why they disappeared. But it was a slow process. And it may also have been influenced, perhaps in Europe, I think, by the rise of the Enlightenment, where you're putting more emphasis on reason. And that kind of is contrary to praising folly. So it may be the Enlightenment thought we can figure this all out through being rational and reasonable. I think we're still testing that.
And so we, as you say, it's not sort of everybody suddenly decide enough of this now.
No.
It sort of just fades out. And yeah. I guess to your point around theatre, I mean, it starts to be, if I pull this right to where we are now, we clearly have risk management functions, and we have journalists that sort of in many countries, not in all, obviously. In theory, we have a free press. We have satirists. So all of these dynamics seem to exist in some way, shape, or form in the modern world. They're just not beautifully sat within one person's remit. I
think that's fair. So I think the journalists, definitely cartoonists, political cartoonists, have some of that role. The satirists, the comedians. Sometimes, for example, in Weimar, Germany, you had cabaret comedians who were basically standing on stage and daring to criticize what was going on with the Nazis. And one of them, in fact, ended up in a concentration camp. So they had that role. But I think one of the key differences between all these roles and the way that role has morphed into different positions is the political cartoonists, as far as I'm aware, they don't have the direct ear or eye of the person in power. So while, for example, in a democracy, maybe the politicians will watch the opinion polls, do they actually watch the satirists, the comedians, or look at the cartoons and say, oh my God, I need to change something because of this cartoonist or this satire? I don't think they do. They don't pay beyond opinion polls. They probably don't pay that much attention to those kind of commentary. So I think that's a key difference, is when you had a more absolute power, you had this person sitting behind just whispering in the ear or cracking jokes directly into the ear of the person in power. Maybe that still goes on. Maybe CEOs have somebody tucked away among their entourage. It would be natural that we wouldn't necessarily know about it because you'd operate below the radar. But I don't see much evidence of it. And I have a friend who's a head of strategy in a big firm. She said, I can tell you there is zero appetite for this kind of thing.
Well, because it really struck me that when we look at power bases, you've got the as you point out, there's the monarchy, the absolute monarch, who probably feels comfortable enough in their role to be able to allow that. We then have dictators that you talk about a little bit around, saying, well, we don't want any challenge whatsoever because that would undermine the model. And I guess in many companies, we have an interesting sort of balance of those two things, which is, in theory, the chief execs want to be seen to be engaging and listening and all those sorts of things, and politicians as well. But on the other hand, there's a reluctance to take some of that challenge on board. And so there's closer to dictatorial behavior, shut out criticism, pretend everything's fine here because that's a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
So there's a fascinating balance here between different types of authority, and some that would, some that are very clearly willing to embrace it, and others where that would be seen as a bad thing, that would undermine the authority.
Yeah, and I don't know how you come up with good incentives to dare to speak out in a company or another institution, modern institution, because it's not obvious that it's good for your career. And it's not clear how you make it good for your career. I did for fun. I was asked to do an article for a management journal about the possible role of jesters in modern organizations. And I did for fun. I did a job description.
So that's amazing.
Yeah. So if you, the CEO, would like, you just have to use my template. It's there, and you just fill in your name and how important you are and everything. And one of the key requirements was that you have a track record of being fired for telling the truth. And that would go in your favor. So it isn't obvious how you make it attractive to stick your neck out and tell the truth. I know some companies, they now talk, what do they call about it? Radical candor is a new term. Yeah. So these guys have been doing radical candor for thousands of years.
And to your point around the sort of ostracization, I mean, if we look at whistleblowers, for example, and I'm ignoring people that do sort of frivolous thing, but genuinely people that have called things out. Yeah. That tends not to work in their favor. Yeah. As you say, they get thrown out. And that point around employment, I think, is really interesting, because not only are you not only does it cause you problems with the employer or the organization that you're whistleblowing on, but other people look at that as a slightly strange thing. Whereas the construct of the fool, the jester, is it's actively supported. It's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. The whistleblower is a good example. How many people, the whistleblowers we hear about in the news, then get somebody calling up, say, "Hey, you're just what I need. Come and work for me."
Come and stir the pot over here, right? Yeah,
exactly. So I think that is a real problem. And going back to why did these absolute monarchs allow this? And it may be, I think you made the point, they were perhaps secure enough in their position that ultimately they could chop off your head if they didn't like it. So they could be a little more, at least theoretically, more tolerant.
It was interesting when you referenced Weimar Germany and the sort of the Nazi response to that. And we can see, there are lots of other governments that stamp out any dissent whatsoever. and anything that even points vaguely in that. If I look at North Korea, an absolute stamping out of Western culture, because that's viewed to be pernicious. So even sort of watching a soap opera with freedom of opinion, let alone somebody that was straight out there, those models seem to ignore that, and that seems to me to be a tremendous weakness, because it sort of presupposes that the ruling party or the ruler are always going to get things right, which we know human beings don't.
And the other thing, the weakness is, it means if you simply stamp out any dissent, if the pressure builds up too much, the whole thing will implode. There's no resilience, there's no safety valves, there's no steam being let off, or the monarch, equivalent dictator monarch, modifying their behavior to keep their mandate. In China, okay, you're emperor and you're all powerful, but you also had this idea of having a mandate to rule, mandate of heaven. And if suddenly there were famines and droughts and pestilence and so on, you could lose your mandate. Heaven's mandate has been withdrawn from you. So they had a kind of divine accountability, which perhaps that helped them keep a little bit sort of, we have to still think about feeding people, we have to think about taking care of people to a certain extent.
Well, I guess ultimately you need your people to live, otherwise you have nothing to rule over.
And actually there are examples, there's a couple of examples, one in India and one in China, of the emperor going hunting and trampling the crops because he's pursuing the prey. And then in the Chinese case, a magistrate came and remonstrated with him and said, you're trampling the crops. Your Majesty, please don't do this. And the emperor was outraged. Who are you to tell me where I can and can't hunt? Chop off your head, basically. And the jester, and this is an interesting technique they often used, they wouldn't directly defy the daft idea. They would go along with it, and they would take it to an absurd logical conclusion. And then the emperor or king would themselves say, yeah, right, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Okay, let's drop it. So in this case, when the emperor said this magistrate should be executed, the jester agreed with him and said, absolutely, this is outrageous. How dare he tell you where you can hunt and where you can't hunt? And, how dare he ensure that the peasants can produce crops and therefore pay their taxes? And then the emperor starts to make a connection and say, oh, right, yeah, okay, let the magistrate live. So that sort of taking that's an interesting technique. Maybe that would work in a modern company, is you don't tell the CEO it's a daft idea. You agree with it to the
you over-execute.
Over-execute.
But that's fascinating. So there's it makes perfect sense, right? So there's a deep psychological understanding on the part of the jester.
Yeah.
As to what buttons press. While we're on that, what other techniques are there? I think this is really interesting from what we could learn from today. Anything else that comes to mind in terms of clever techniques or tactics that they would use that might not be obvious?
No, I think that's one of the main ones. Sometimes they did the opposite. They would almost shock the king or emperor with their radical candor, or they play tricks. So, for example, there's a story around James I not reading what he signed and just signing things. And then the jester...
Which, of course, I laugh about, right? Because we all do that. All do that. Terms and conditions.
Yeah, terms and conditions. 18 pages of 8 font. So he basically, the jester put something in front of the king, and the king signed it. And then the jester said, right, get up. I'm now king. You've just signed away your throne. So that story, and it may be apocryphal, it may have an element of truth, but, it said in the story, it says the king always knew what he signed thereafter. So it can be just they play a trick like that wakes the king up or the emperor to his own folly.
Bring us back today. As you sort of look around, are there any good examples of 21st century? Clearly lots of idiots out there, but 21st century fools in the sense that you use it. Is there anything we can at all look at today that would say it's analogous? I don't know, regimes that haven't changed much, or
no, I haven't. I mean, I found one passing reference in a business magazine to a couple of Bedouins who were part of the entourage of a Saudi prince and had that role of court jester. That was a passing reference. Apart from that, I haven't really found anything. I think it's this dispersed role through the comedians or the cartoonists. They have a role to play in society, but I'm not sure it's quite the same, because when we watch a comedian satirizing the current affairs or whatever, is it just a safety valve? Is it that we all laugh and chortle and say, oh, yes, indeed, isn't it terrible or whatever? But does it actually change things? Or does it just make us more comfortable in accepting the status quo?
Right.
Oh, comfort for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of sort of bread and circuses around it, in the sense of, well, obviously it can't be that bad because we're allowed to laugh about it.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is interesting in this dynamic, and if you look at Trump and to a certain extent Boris Johnson, and we'll come back to Johnson because I think there's an interesting thing around comedy and the monarch. If you look at Trump, so in a democracy, very excluding of any criticism. And so sort of you're either with us or you're against us sort of mentality, and the language that's used about opponents.
Yeah.
And very strong messages about right and wrong.
Yeah,
we're seeing some interesting moves here where that the challenge element is not permitted,
indeed.
And they'd rather not have some of these democratic processes that are designed to question and checks and balance, if you like.
Yeah, and it's becoming more extreme, which is kind of interesting in that we theoretically have free press, we theoretically have freedom through social media to communicate, and yet the censorship is there, and I'd argue even growing. I don't know how you get around that. It feels to me that we need these jesters more than ever, but I don't know how you reintroduce them. I don't think anybody in the Trump campaign department is going to bring in somebody who really challenges them.
Right, because I mean, he strikes me as being a leader that really wouldn't respond kindly.
No.
To even, very, 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 ironically, very thin-skinned in many respects in terms of sort of personal criticism, and therefore the model that you talk about really wouldn't work. The proverbial beheading or be gone from my, that would happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, because
and you'd never even get into that position.
Because you had in the 20th century, we mentioned the cabaret comedians in Weimar Germany. You also had circus clowns in Russia who would crack jokes. I mean, there's one example where they were told to keep their mouth shut, so they just walked into the circus arena with a big padlock on their mouth. I say nothing. But also in the US, there were a couple of clowns who served, really like a court jester, 2 or 3 American presidents. So Will Rogers served Wilson. And there was Dan Rice served Lincoln, and Roosevelt also. I think Will Rogers also served Roosevelt, and I think it was Roosevelt who said something like, I found his foreign policy analyses to be far more accurate, than, I don't know, the State Department or whatever.
Right.
So it's interesting. You have a couple of American presidents who've had somebody in that role. And then since then, apparently not, or not that we're aware of.
And I'm intrigued by the comedy element, and coming to sort of Boris Johnson, who has many clown-like attributes himself, particularly on display recently. Unfortunately, that's in the UK. Was there a sharp distinction between the comedy that the jester and the fool was allowed to perpetuate, and the monarch and their seriousness, or is that too simple a piece? Because it always struck me that if you want to hold high office, you need to be seen as a serious character, and taking big life and death decisions, and anything that might be ridiculous would undermine your position in theory. And so how would you bring comedy into the room? Have somebody else bring it in, so you're not associated with being a fool. And yet if we look at one of the things that Johnson manages to do to engage people is precisely almost play the fool himself, be a bit of a bumbling idiot. That's very I'm not suggesting he is actually. He's very, very intelligent, but he seems to have blurred those lines, and I wondered if you had any observations on that.
But I think his comedy, it isn't about criticizing himself or holding himself to account. It's more, for me, a bit of smoke and mirrors tactic to reach out to people, to make himself more accessible to them, and to sort of I guess it is a kind of cloak behind which, and I agree with you, I think he's an extremely clever person, but it does make him seem more accessible, and it can kind of asking for forgiveness and tolerance of his behavior, but he's not calling himself to account the way a jester would.
Right.
But I think you made an important point about seriousness. And I feel that's something, maybe it's a modern thing, I don't know, but this idea that to be taken seriously, you have to be serious and earnest. And for me, there's a distinction between earnestness, a sort of lack of humor or lack of comedy, and that's quite distinct from being serious. And you can use humor for very serious topics. And I think we saw that in the aftermath, for example, of Charlie Hebdo. Some of the cartoons that came out were painful. I mean, and similarly, in the run-up to the Second World War, there were cartoonists who saw what was going on and really called out the powers that be, the democracies, for not standing up to Hitler and so on. And one of the interesting things about the cartoon, and it was a cartoonist who pointed this out, is a cartoon, you get the joke before you can get your defenses up.
Ah, okay.
Right? You look at a cartoon, you immediately get the point. And then you might sort of bring in your defenses and say, well, yes, but blah, blah, blah. But it's a very direct form of communication. It gets under your skin before you can block.
I was going to say it's too late by then, right? Because it's landed, and then you're going,
yeah. Then you're sort of backpedaling, trying to come up with an excuse for what you don't want to confront. So I think that may be part of the power of the comedy side, is that it just gets through the defenses.
It plays on a very visceral level, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in many cases very, very primitive.
Yeah.
And so we're sort of lulled into accepting it because it stealths its way in.
Yeah.
And I think your point around comedy, I think is interesting, because there is a sort of perception, not just in terms of people and how they have to be serious, but also this is a very serious, so we mustn't joke about this type mentality.
Yeah.
And clearly there are certain subjects that start to get incredibly sensitive.
Yeah.
That one wouldn't want to make jokes about, because that gets into the offensive. But there are a ton of other things where the subject matter is incredibly serious, but the way that you most effectively communicate it is through exactly these elements. So I think, for example, of airline safety briefings, very, very important information that's being transmitted, because this could literally save your life. And yet, if you sat there and went, let me tell you about the mechanics of airline safety, no one's going to listen. So what do? It's not always effective, but they use comedy and cartoons and other things like that to get through. So it's a similar point that you're making, which is, and I tend to say the more serious the subject, potentially the more we need to deploy comedy, the more we need to think about alternative ways, because particularly if it's a gruesome message, we're very good at shutting it off.
Yeah. And I think it is a very delicate issue. There are, as you say, there are certain areas, I suppose you're getting into the whole element of freedom of speech. Where do you draw the line causing offense or distress? And how far can humor help you actually confront very tricky issues without taking them lightly? And that's this distinction between humor and non-humor, and taking something seriously or being flippant about it. It's a very delicate, complex sort of configuration, I think, to get right.
As you say, it requires a very deft touch.
Yeah.
In the sense that you could sort of, and I think, what this is what I find really interesting about the idea of somebody who's been given a license to criticize, and at the same time has to be wary of overstepping the mark and really playing it finely. And so it's the sort of equivalent of a stand-up comedian that bombs a little bit, but actually the consequences aren't that the audience boos you or heckles you. It's like it's potentially much more serious.
Yes.
And so it requires that delicate, deft touch. And I think there's a lovely illustration here of sort of, this is what humans are really good at. You couldn't program a machine to fulfill the role of the court jester.
No, I don't think
because
so.
It would go horribly wrong somewhere along the line.
No, I think, and that is one of their key talents, is this psychological acuity. And you see it if you look at a performing clown in the street and he's got a crowd of kids and adults, it always fascinated me watching them, is how good they are at knowing who can I pick on in this audience. So they've got 50 faces around them, they're going to do a trick where they're going to haul you out of the audience. If you're just going to curl up and die of embarrassment, their idea will not work. So they have to make that decision while they're performing. Who can I pick on? Who can I joke with? And one clown told me, he said, I can see who the kid is that is really sad and needs some attention or love or care. And that's one of their key strengths, is this sort of acuity, just deciding as they're performing what they can get away with and how to do it. You have examples. There's one Chinese example where the emperor was furious because the jester basically cracked a joke that was insulting the dignity of the emperor. So the emperor drew his bow to kill the jester. And the jester's name was Newly Polished Mirror. And he cracked a joke about, if you shoot me, it won't reflect well on you, and so on. So to be able to crack a joke when the guy is about to shoot you, and the emperor laughed and put down the bow, and that was that.
Wow.
I mean, if I can't think of a greater example of psychological acuity and quick-wittedness to think on your feet when you're about to be executed.
Yeah, because it's the stuff of movies, right? Quick quips before you're executed. Yeah, exactly. But that's phenomenal. And while we're on the subject of clowns, is there any linkage between fools and clowns?
I think there's a lot of linkage. There's the skills are very similar. The key difference for me is the fool, if we're talking about the court fool, has this kind of one-to-one relationship with the person in power. And the clown generally doesn't have that. That's probably the main distinction.
So the clown's a bit more transactional.
Transactional and more dealing with society more generally. But you had, for example, in Elizabethan England, you had actors on the stage who would be clowns on the stage, who would then go to the court and have that role and be a kind of jester, step in and out of that jester role. So an actor like Richard Tarleton, he could be a clown in a play where he'd have a script. He could be a clown in a play where he would improvise his own wit, just stick in a few lines here and there. Or he would be performing at the court and he would be like a jester to the Queen. So it's a very interesting sort of range. This clown fool, it's more a spectrum than two different roles.
And that sort of multi-job. I presume when we go back, jesters that was your full-time job. You didn't do other things. You were sort of permanently at the beck and call.
Mostly it was a full-time job, and they would be there for a long time. You have, for example, Will Sommers was jester to Henry VIII, and then he turns up in the court account books of Mary and Elizabeth I. So they just go from one to the next, assuming they didn't get kicked out of court.
And I guess if there's any sort of interreg, you go off and polish your material. So
right, exactly.
You're on tour again.
Exactly. So they often could serve for quite a long time. But you could also you see again, the court account books are really good examples where the king might be on a progress through the country, and then somebody just performs for him in a village. You see pictures of our queen going to a village and a child might give her a bunch of flowers. So there you might have somebody just cracks a joke, and then it will say, the king gave him a shilling for his performance or his entertainment or whatever. So you could have this. And you would have examples also of kings giving a gift to the jester of another